What I'm going to talk about is the blockade and how it's been presented in the media and what its ultimate aims are. I called it turning the screw while spinning the story, and I think it accurately sums up what's going on. First, let's talk about the story. We're told about it's going to be easing the blockade, easing the embargo. Obama has come in and made a whole series of changes. It's now amazing. Cubans can go back to Cuba sometimes. It's equally amazing that some Americans might just about be able to get there if they happen to be journalists and got a license to go. After all those major steps forwards by the USA, they're now waiting on Cuba to respond and change its system, change its leader, just so that they can be grateful for the small changes that we made to the embargo. The reality is very different to that. The blockade was unilaterally imposed by the United States of America. There was no Cuban involvement in the decision to impose the blockade, and Cuba resisted it and has resisted it ever since. It's been progressively intensified since the early 1960s when it was introduced first. Every act that's been passed has ratcheted up the blockade year by year by year. And that's continuing to this year. And I'll show examples of what's happening this year that didn't happen last year. And you can judge for yourself whether that's a reduction of the blockade or not. The blockade is essentially genocidal in nature. And I use the word advisory. Under the Genocide Convention, targeting an identified national group for special treatment with the purpose of implementing political changes that they don't wish to see is the definition of genocide. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a genocidal, illegal blockade. 19 years. For 19 years, the United Nations has voted overwhelmingly against the Cuban blockade. There are only 2 countries in the world in that 19 years that have continued to vote in support of the blockade. The first one is the United States, and the second one is Israel. No other country has a similar record of voting in favor of the blockade. About the only thing that the United Nations agrees on is that the blockade of Cuba is illegal. There is no other policy of any government that commands the kind of levels of support that the Cuban motion that's presented before the General Assembly every year on the necessity to end it. It gets absolutely overwhelming support. In fact, it's difficult to know how much more support Cuba can expect to receive unless we manufacture new countries that can now add their names to the Cuban side of the vote. 2 countries are left exposed for their support of genocide through their vote. There's only one country in the world that can actually change it, the country that imposed it, and that's the United States of America. And there is no argument. It's either lifted or it's not lifted. And the only ones who can decide on that is the United States. There is no influence of Cuba over this. There's no influence of any other country. There is one country responsible for the blockade, and there is one country responsible for lifting it. And when they lift it, everything is different. Let me just talk about the direct economic consequences of the blockade. In just pounds and shillings and pence, or what's now euros and cents, it's 100 US billion directly is the cost of the blockade. Adjusted for inflation, just for inflation, it's 239 billion. Let's look at that in an Irish context. That's 4.5 times the cost of NAMA, right? We know what NAMA is going to cost us. We know how long we're going to be paying for NAMA. If you were having a NAMA every 10 years, how would you survive as a society? Ireland's got to ask itself that. But you've got to add to that the underdevelopment of the Cuban nature, of the Cuban society, due to historical reasons and occupation by the United States and Spain before it. The Cuban economy is 1/17 the size of Ireland. And they're dealing with 4.5 NAMAs in the last 50 years. That puts it into context. The whole point of this blockade is to starve them into submission. There is no justification for it. It's a global system of extortion. And I use that word deliberately. It's built on pillars that mirror the mafia. The first is the major player in all of this is what's known as the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is a department of the US Treasury. It's linked in with the SWIFT banking system. Every time you make a transaction in Europe, you pay your dentist bill with a check, or do a bank transfer for your kids' clothes in a shop. That transaction is recorded through SWIFT. It's reported to the United States through SWIFT. There's an agreement between the EU and the United States that allows the United States to request any detail on any financial transaction in Europe and be given it. That's what SWIFT does. It's very swift. It tells them exactly who's writing checks with the word Cuba on the top. It tells them exactly who's making a PayPal transaction to any given account on any internet site in the world. And it's doing it very swiftly. And the European Parliament is allowing that to happen. It's allowing all of those transactions between Europeans to be reported to the United States for the purpose of making sure that the United States knows who's funding the US government, who's funding the Cubans, and what transactions they're making in the world. The no-fly list. You know this thing you get on a plane to fly transatlantic, and somebody somewhere has to send 35 pieces or 39 pieces of documentation about you to the US government so they can check it off and then decide whether they're going to allow your plane to land or not. On that no-fly list are the names of European business people who have traded with Cuba. If you've traded with Cuba and you've been prosecuted by the big guys, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, you're not allowed to land in the United States. Not only that, your wife is not allowed to accompany you. Your children are not allowed to accompany you. They're all persona non grata because you're funding the Cuban trade. Every single piece of trade contract signed by a US company contains a clause that says goods cannot be transferred to Cuba. The beneficial ownership of this cannot go to Cuba. I'm not just talking about when you buy something on the internet from a US website. I'm talking about every single contract that a US entity enters into with anybody, anywhere in the world. So if you go to the Dell shop and buy a Dell computer in Russia, in China, in Holland, you sign a contract that says that you're not going to send that computer to Cuba. Every time you click I agree on the bottom of a piece of software to download it onto your machine, the conditions that you don't read, down the bottom of that list will be a reference to the trading with the enemy. You have agreed to implement the blockade with Cuba by clicking that I agree sign. Currency trading. You're not allowed, if you're a bank, to trade in US dollars unless you recognize certain rights of the US government to control its currency. Now there are issues, there are reasons why that should be the case. But one of the things that imposes on you as a bank, as a financial institution, as an insurance company, as a medical insurer, is the requirement that you report to the Office of Foreign Assets Control any transactions that you have with Cuba. And if they don't like what you're doing with Cuba, they will fine you, and they will fine you big time. Cuba, the last leg of this global system of extortion is based on terrorist law. Cuba is the absolute non-terrorist country in the world. Ireland, the Irish government is more terrorist than Cuba in reality. Yet, Cuba is designated by the US government as a terrorist state. The reason for this is so that it can bring in all that panoply of legal sanctions. It can bring them to bear on all of their government-to-government transactions, but it can also impose them on governments in every jurisdiction in the world, because if you're not the Cuban government and you're trading or doing something with the Cuban government, you're now an accessory to a terrorist state. These are the 6 legs on which the global extortion system is built. Let me just deal with one of those legs, which is the global financial system. Again, we come back to the big bogey in all of this, US Office of Foreign Assets Control, which controls all of this financial strangulation. ABN Bank, a very respected, highly respected, one of the safest banks in the world. ABN AMRO is a Dutch trade union pension fund, and they were fined 80 billion in 2005. USB, Union Bank of Switzerland, one of the largest banks in Europe, was fined 100 million in 2004. Lloyds, TSB, British Bank, we all know them, fined 350 million. You might notice a pattern. Credit Suisse, 536 million in 2009. What did they do to deserve that? Well, let's look at Credit Suisse. It transferred a total of 323,648 US dollars to entities with Cuban addresses in 32 different transactions. And yet it was fined 536 million for having done that. They haven't sent any money to Cuba since. As far as the global blockade goes, and I call it Obama's because Obama has implemented it. Every boat that touches Cuban soil, lands in the Cuban harbor, is sterilized. It's not allowed to enter US waters for 180 days. Now that means that if you're a packaging company and you're sending goods all around the world, what you try to do is you said, oh, so many packets will go to Cuba, so many packets will go to Florida, so many packets will go to Miami, so many packets will, and the boat will do all those one after the other, and it's efficient. Now you have to charter a special boat to go to Cuba and come back. You can't go on to Miami, you can't go on to Florida, you can't go on to Louisiana to discharge the rest of your cargo. You can't even sail the sailing dinghy to Cuba if you live in the United States. Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, they're all banned from dealing with Cuban internet addresses. You can't download Google Maps in Cuba. It's illegal. It's breaking the blockade. The Office of Foreign Assets Control will come after you. Just last week, Irish musicians, traditional Irish musicians, were invited to attend the Celtic Music Festival, the second Celtic Music Festival in Havana. They were not allowed to travel by the US government. These are Irish musicians with banjos and guitars and accordions and tin whistles going to a Celtic Music Festival in Havana, and the US government, Barack Obama says, thou shalt not pass. That's how it affects non-US people. Just to continue the theme, no country, no company on the planet can sell any product to Cuba which has more than 10% of US products contained within it. Now that means if they use the paint on a bicycle that happens to be US paint, you can't sell the bike to Cuba. It means if the microchip inside a computer box has a little bit of Cuban-derived copper or nickel or something like that, it can't be sold to Cuba. If you're an investor, I spoke about the no-fly list, you're an investor in a Cuban business, like an Irish investor or a Spanish investor, you're banned from visiting the United States, and your family is banned. Cuba can't buy, for example, it came up recently, air monitoring for nuclear radiation levels as a result of the Japanese nuclear emergency. Cuba is not allowed to test its own air because the equipment is regarded as military, and the United States doesn't let anybody sell it to Cuba. As I said, every time you click I agree, you're agreeing with the United States blockade of Cuba. In Ireland, Boston Scientific produces a very nice piece of medical equipment, especially for children. It's a stent, can be inserted into a heart valve and relieve the flow of blood. Particularly, it's a condition that particularly affects Down syndrome children. And the only other alternative is for open heart surgery to take place. Now, most of these children are medically unfit because they have poor heart conditions, and putting them under general anesthetic risks their lives. This product was designed in Ireland. It's made in Ireland. It's a guaranteed Irish symbol on it. It was built in a factory that is IEA supported. The research is funded by the Irish government. FÁS train the workers in how to make it. They get capital write-offs on the investment that they've made in plant and machinery to produce it. And they get 12.5% corporation profits tax at the generosity of the Irish taxpayer. They're not allowed to sell that to Cuba. 6 Cuban children underwent open heart surgery in 2009 because they couldn't get access to that Boston scientific stent. You could put 5 of them in your pocket and fly them. They're not allowed to sell them. More on Ireland. We received, the Cuba Support Group did a response to the Haitian earthquake, this time last January. We set up a bank account, we brought some Cuban films over, we toured the country with them. I went to speak in Belfast. The follow-up from that was that one of the trade union, one of the group's trade union official that I had spoken to gave us a cheque for £600 sterling for the Cuban doctors who were working in Haiti. The cheque bounce was returned to our Belfast branch. Barclays refused to change it into euros and transfer it to our Cuba aid account in Dublin. Funny enough, we didn't understand why. We tried to find out. Eventually, we persuaded them that they had to do it. We used a different bank other than Barclays to do it. In fact, we posted it south of the border and lodged it to our account directly as a sterling cheque, and it cleared. But Barclays Bank was one of those banks that the Office of Foreign Assets Control had fined $289 million in 2010 for trading in Cuba. So it's no wonder they're not cashing cheques for Irish trade unionists. A cheque sent from Belfast to Dublin was intercepted in Washington. That's the nature of the blockade. We set up a website to accept donations for the Haitian earthquake. We approached PayPal to accept credit card donations on that website. They quoted the Trading with the Enemy Act to us. The money, remember, was being raised in Ireland and being transferred to Haiti to buy medical supplies to supply doctors, saving lives of Haitians in Haiti. The only problem with it, the fly in the ointment, was that the doctors happened to be Cuban. 50% of all the doctors in Haiti are Cuban. Now we see how big this blockade is. This is the letter, this is the email, I don't know if you can see, probably can't see the text. This is the email we got from PayPal. PayPal will be in violation under the Trading with the Enemy Act if we facilitated transactions where funds benefit Cuba, and would be subject to penalties defined by the Office of Foreign Assets Control. So they're only scared. There's nobody else on the internet that accepts credit card payments, so we're stuck. I suggest the Irish government needs to do 2 things. The first, it must make all state benefits to US corporations contingent on them following Irish law. Seems like a reasonable quid pro quo. If you get 12.5% profits tax on your profits, and you're repatriating profits from God knows where to Ireland to avail of it, the least you should do is apply Irish law, not US law. The Irish government needs to do more. It needs to actually set up fines for companies who refuse to do that, and the fines must be a direct mirror of whatever the Office of Foreign Assets Control would have them fined otherwise. That's the only way there will be a level playing field and they can actually agree to follow US law. That's my speech. Thanks for listening. If you want to follow what Cuba Support Group is doing, we're on Twitter, Cuba Support, or Google us at Cuba Support and you'll find us. There are, on the desk in the hall, there are membership forms. You sign up, give us your email address, we'll put you on the list, and you'll get regular updates about the blockade and about everything else that you're going to see over this day. Thanks very much.